Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. The Minuteman, with his three-cornered hat and musket, is an enduring symbol of America's Revolutionary War. In our time, both the symbol and substance of America's global military response is conveyed by the Green Beret and M4 automatic rifle of the Special Forces soldier. In conflicts that run the gamut from the major engagements of this country's wars to anonymous encounters worldwide, these soldiers are active, day and night, wherever in the world their talents are needed. And those talents, constantly honed in training, cover an extraordinary spectrum of physical and intellectual abilities. A closer acquaintance with the missions and methods of this elite force is one way of understanding the dangers and challenges of our 21st century world. My guest is Linda Robinson, author of Masters of Chaos, The Secret History of the Special Forces. Linda, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you.
Linda, let me display this very evocative cover for everyone to see because it is faithful to the contents of the book. This is the story of these men and what they have managed to do in recent wars, but also, and I think this is one of the first points we must talk about, over the past 50 years. Since 1952, when they were 50 and more, founded in 52. And that founding, Linda, owes largely to a very remarkable man I'd love you to comment on, and his name is Colonel Aaron Banks, I believe. He's a legendary figure. What actually did he have to do with it?
Yes. Colonel Aaron Banks is considered the founder of the Army Special Forces, which is the unit that I wrote about in the book. And he grew up with the most unusual background, spending summers in Europe as a lifeguard and swimming coach teacher over in Biarritz in Europe. And that, in fact, was where the Special Forces units, when they were first formed in 1952, they were sent to Germany. And the original intent was to use them as a kind of stay-behind force, the scenario being that the Soviet Union would possibly overrun Western Europe, and there would be a need to raise a resistance force, a partisan force, to help fight against a Soviet occupation of Western Europe. So they were there to help the Europeans form a resistance force and fight behind the enemy lines. So they had the airborne training and all of this kind of specialized training.
Did a part of what inspired Colonel Banks and led the Colonel and others to forge this group that you've so well described in its origins, did part of that inspiration also come from things like the OSS experience in World War II and perhaps the British experience with the special air services and such?
Yes, exactly. And in fact, in one of the several units that are considered sort of spiritual ancestors of the Special Forces was the Jedburghs, and those were actually multinational forces. British, American, French. They would go in three-man teams with the radio man, a medic, and someone from one of the host countries, so that they would have the language capability. And that kind of mirrors what happened with the formation of the Special Forces. It's a 12-man team, and they have 6 specialties: communicator, medic, engineer, demolitions, the intelligence sergeant, and the operations sergeant, the captain, and the master sergeant or the team sergeant. And so anyway, each has his own specific role, and they can split that team of 12 in half and function as a self-contained split team or 6-man team. So it was designed to really cover a whole range of specialties with very experienced sergeants.
You know, I'm so glad you described the profile of these teams, these 12-man units, led typically by a captain with a warrant officer, and then the rest of them were all sergeants, including the team sergeants, kind of the key sergeant in that sense. But they're the very essence of force amplification, aren't they? I mean, what these 12 individuals can do, set down in trying circumstances, is extraordinary. I mean, it's just their whole role, as I saw it, was not just to be a battle force in their own right, but to sort of make magnitudes of force happen
That's right.
beyond their own numbers.
That's right, and they use that term force multiplier, and that is exactly what they've always seen themselves as being. Whether in Europe, in that stay behind scenario, they would be raising a force of Europeans who would actually do the bulk of the fighting or whatever the mission was. And it was also their next big mission was, of course, in Vietnam, and that was the era in which the Special Forces grew tremendously, but they were working there with the Montagnards and the other hill tribes. So they always saw themselves as empowering, enabling, training, supporting a host nation or the indigenous force of a country so that they would be the ones actually doing most of the work.
And we'll see this repeatedly in your book. We see them working with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, with the Kurdish forces in Iraq. That force multiplication has been a constant. Everything that they do, Linda, I think you would agree, starts with their training, starts with the very selection process that brings them together, and then, and I'd love you to get you to comment on this, the rather extraordinary Q course, a year-long Olympiad that they go through. Would you describe both the nature of that course and what its purpose is?
Yes, the selection and qualification course, which is where they get the abbreviation Q course, requires them first, they've had a couple of years of experience in the Army, although they're now beginning to draw some people directly from civilian life, and they have to have gone to airborne school. They're airborne qualified, meaning they have jump status. They know how to parachute out of planes, and then they come to Fort Bragg, which is where the Army Special Forces school is, and they undergo the most arduous training. The Navy SEALs also have arduous training, so I won't say it's the most, but it's very rigorous, and the first round really is to try to test their mettle in a physical way. And it's endurance as much as brute strength. And endurance, of course, also involves mental tenacity.
Exactly.
So right from the beginning, they're really testing not just physical, but also their mental powers. And after that phase, they begin doing much more team exercises and their ability to think unconventionally and all of these different phases of the training that really they're looking for a very unusual kind of innovative thinker for their selection.
I'm so glad you made that point. And I would also add to what you said that 70% wash out.
That's right.
That don't make it over
Very
the course
tough,
of this year. And I like that point you made at the end there about the mental aspect of this, because as I read the book, I began to think it was not so much, or not only daring do, but creative thinking and trying circumstances. That's one of the things that's emphasized. And there's a second thing that comes through repeatedly in this book, Linda, and might start in the training phase, and that's the familial bond that seems to develop between these small teams. They seem to get, in a very personal, psychological way, bonded. As they proceed.
Very tight. And I think it's a characteristic of small units generally that they do bond together because it is such an intimate. These people live and train together. They deploy for 6 months, and not just now during these times of Iraq and Afghanistan, but through their entire careers. They're out deploying to the hinterlands as this group. And they may shift teams, but they generally stay in the same company or battalion for their entire career. And once these people have volunteered 3 times and gone through the arduous training, many of them tend to stay for 20 and 30 years. So they're lifers.
Lifers indeed. And in the life of the force itself, as you mentioned earlier, Vietnam was a very significant chapter. But it's a chapter, Linda, that I want to turn to now because I think it posed a very significant challenge to the Special Forces. And that is, they were extensively deployed in Vietnam, as we all know, but the war had a melancholy end. And I'm wondering, and you were extremely close to the force and to the men in it as you compiled this book, did you get a sense that they, as a group, as a unit, they felt that there was a period post-Vietnam War where they had to sort of recover morale, a sense of mission, and that kind of thing? Yes,
and not just morale, actually. I mean, Vietnam was their previous largest, their heyday. Then after Vietnam, the Special Forces were almost decimated. They were literally almost disbanded. They only had a couple of active duty groups, which is their formal units called a group. And then they were built up again in the 80s. Now there are 5 active duty groups, 1 each assigned to Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, Europe, and then they have 2 National Guard groups, and the plan now is to grow several more battalions and increase by 1/3. So they're back up to kind of heyday levels now. But they really went through a period of dramatic contraction, and there was also a sense that they'd expanded too rapidly during Vietnam, and the standards had been dropped, and they had some issues of discipline and so forth. So really, and this book was it's a portrait of the post-Vietnam generation. These 15 or so men I focus on in the book, they began their combat or frontline duty with either Desert Storm over in Kuwait in '91 or Just Cause in Panama, and then through the '90s were deployed in the various places, Somalia, the Balkans, Just Cause Panama, as I mentioned, Central America, and then on to Afghanistan and Iraq.
In each of the places they're deployed and each of the battles they fought are very, very thoroughly depicted in this book. And going back to Just Cause in Panama, which was the apprehension of General Noriega in about 1991, I believe.
1990.
You make a point, and I think this goes well against the background that you just gave us about the need to sort of the recovery period, if you will, to rebuild the force in the 80s, that Panama represents for the Special Forces not just a victory, but kind of a recovery of its own sense of mission. So it's a major triumph, is it not, in terms of what the force did and proved it could do?
Yes, and that was really because they were, as opposed to Desert Storm, where they played a fairly limited reconnaissance role. For Just Cause in Panama, they had a whole panoply of missions planned, and they actually executed a fair number of them. Not only in the December 1989 was the actual invasion, but for a full year after that, there was Operation Promote Liberty, and individual teams of these 12 men were fanned out throughout the country and working in little towns. And that was really the stabilization and security mission, because there was an entire new military formed. They disbanded and formed a new military, and this is one of their core missions, which is to train new security forces.
That's almost a perfect foundation, if you will, for a quote I want to draw from the book at this very point, Linda. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm going to, because I think this quote, which derives from the Panama experience, really sums up the broad range of things that the Special Forces have to do. And it is, putting the country back together is part of the conflict in the Special Forces view. War is not just the period between when the shooting begins and when it ends. So their mission, which the public may not be thoroughly briefed on, is far vaster than just battlefield activity.
Right, and in fact, their view is their mission is in a human terrain. The battlefield isn't tanks and physical terrain. It's really about a battle for the sentiment of a population. And that's why they're very often involved in either guerrilla conflicts or these kind of murky wars where the adversary is within the population. They have to be able to understand what are the motivations of the guerrilla force, the sentiments of the population, and really do a lot of social work, in effect. That's,
again, marvelously said, if I may say so, Linda, because I kept note as I was reading the book about these very different encounters from Panama to Iraq to Afghanistan, but repeatedly the same principles come forth. And let me just go through them. I think you've just given us some insight into some of them. Economy of force organization. These are the 12-man groups are very small. They gather extensive intelligence in all that they do. Planning from the ground up, I was really struck by this. There doesn't seem to be much standing on rank in the way that they operate. And then they use local assets. And then this final point, their cultural integration, if you will. I was very struck by that. Are these the qualities that you found in the way that they...
Yes, absolutely. And I might just say that there is, when people read this book, they're surprised that there's relatively little combat. And one of the things, their little mantras they use is use the weapon between your ears. It's much more about thinking through what's the problem and thinking through what's the solution. Because these people are very aware that once you start having to pull the trigger, you're going to create more animosities, you're going to potentially create more guerrillas, and so they really try to avoid a combat scenario ceasefire when there's another solution that can work. And they are trained, they're the only unit in the U.S. Army that must have language training before they are deployed. It's a unit requirement. And that also, it's not just foreign language, but it's the cultural education that goes along with it. And in the case of Iraq, they really broke down into very small areas where a city would be the area for one team, and they would have to learn all about the tribes and the networks in that area so that they were prepared to go in and deal with the people there.
What they were able to do, I drew from this book, was literally map the city, not just physically, but culturally, socially, and it was just quite extraordinary. And in fact, to dwell on the Iraq experience, there are essentially two Iraq experiences, aren't they? I mean, they did a lot of the pre-intelligence work prior to Desert Storm, and of course and I think there are 3 or 4 chapters devoted to their current activities in Iraq in this book, which are quite diverse. One in particular I want to bring out for our discussion, Linda, because it struck me as so novel. I think this goes to the start of the Iraq War, where the Emir of Kuwait insists, basically, that something called the Badr Brigade, be involved in the invasion. And of course, this is a sort of hodgepodge group, as I understood it, but it presents the special forces with a real challenge. They've got to involve, they're very highly trained, and they've got to make this motley group work to their advantage. I thought it brought together all the kind of cultural challenges and political and military challenges you could possibly face.
Yes, and I want to be clear because it's interesting. That group, the Badr Brigade of Kuwait, and this was Desert Storm, so 1991, the Emir of Kuwait wanted to have some Kuwaitis out front, and that's very much the way the Special Forces operate. They try always to have local forces as much out front so it's less of a U.S. footprint doing it. But these were not military people mostly, so they had to go through a very intensive training. I just want to make that distinction because, of course, now in Iraq, there's a totally different organization called the Badr Brigade, Badr Corps, that is a different group allied with one of the Shia elements there. And so that's a very different group that they haven't been involved in training. But in the case of Kuwait in 1991, that was an ally they went in with, and they put them out in Kuwait City very early on, but they were very focused on how to give them tasks they were capable of doing and not risk the friendly fire kind of situation. And that's very common because I also personally witnessed the setting up of an Iraqi militia in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and it was the same kind of thing. Some of them had some military experience, but they really tried to do ground-up training, but the idea was to get Iraqis out manning checkpoints, so it would not be such a U.S. heavy hand. And one of the team captains said to me, because he is now involved in a subsequent effort to train Iraqi Special Operations Forces, he said, gee, if we hadn't disbanded that militia, which was a much higher level decision, he said we would have been farther ahead of the game now. Because it was disbanded, and then a year later they were having to start all over again, forming the Iraqi military.
When we talk about forming groups, working together with groups, cultural sensitivity, and trying circumstances and all these things, I can't imagine a more powerful example, Linda, and brought forth in this book, than what they accomplished in Afghanistan. I think here you have it all. This essentially, to the world's amazement, you have basically 100 men, Special Forces operatives, working together with the Northern Alliance in the month or so that they had to effectively take Kabul, to drive the Taliban out, to do all they did. Would you think that, do you think that's one of their highest points? Yes,
I think it's become the icon, and I think will remain the icon for this generation because it was such a dramatic success. And it was a success, I think, because they had the training and the skills that they had to marry up with and work with primarily the Northern Alliance, although in the South they had militias that were formed much more quickly with Hamid Karzai and those folks around Kandahar. But they had also, I think, critical support. It's important to say the CIA had a few people in early on making some links, and then these folks came in the dead of night over the Hindu Kush, very dramatic infiltration, very tough to get them in, and then they married up with the elements of the Northern Alliance, who of course had been fighting the Taliban, but not did not have anywhere near the firepower, and then, of course, the Special Forces teams could call on the tremendous air power of the
Right.
U.S., and that's where you get that iconic photograph of the fellow with the laser target designator riding on the back of a donkey, calling down this tremendous U.S. Air power onto the Taliban targets in the front lines there, and really overrunning the Taliban government within a number of days. So that's really an example of how they can perform in a combat mission. But a lot of them say, you know, the quiet work we do is often as emblematic of our skill set as that dramatic combat role.
Well said. And again, from reading the book, I didn't think the quiet work that they do was ever better demonstrated than it was in the Balkans, where they essentially served as a communications glue, if you will, and where their sensitivity to the ethnic groups was probably one of the most important aspects of our success there.
Absolutely, and a number of these soldiers had experience there, and one in particular, Colonel Ken Tovo, was there, and he was in the town of Birchko, which was a very conflicted town, and this was the ethnic mosaic of the Balkans was tremendous, and even within one ethnic group, they were mapping, you know, who were the religious leaders, who were the criminal leaders, how this whole network fit together. And Colonel Tovo wound up being one of the key leaders in northern Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and working there with the Kurdish Peshmerga. And the commander there, Colonel Charlie Cleveland, had the experience also in the Balkans and also in Just Cause in Panama. And they were very clear about what lessons they had learned in those previous missions that really enabled them to, with just, again, a few men, face down 11 Iraqi divisions and accomplish some amazing feats up there in the north. Lessons
learned is one of the themes of this group. They seem to constantly apply what they've taken from one situation and bring it forth into another. And they're sort of, if I don't know if they have a formal manual or not, but they seem to be constantly revising their techniques and bringing them up to date. In a sense, I thought they practically train all the time and learn all the time from what they've done.
Well, and in the best of cases, the entire military is a learning machine. And I think you've seen a big effort to try to do that with the entire military, both in terms of revising their doctrine, their manuals, but also making sure their training rotations out in California and Louisiana really mirror what they're seeing on the ground there. But I think that these folks, and one thing I think is important to mention, unlike your average infantry unit, these folks are in their mid-30s, the team sergeants are 40, 41. They have had a lot of experience by the time they're out there. So it's not just any old 12 guys given some basic training and put out in the field. And that, I think, a lot of them say, we're just good, seasoned infantrymen. And that's, I think, the experience factor really accounts for a lot of that, along with their specialized training.
And you see that repeatedly. My favorite episode in this book, is, the one I think is the tensest, in a sense, in a psychological sense, is when they're called upon to drive 300 miles across Somalia and meet with a very colorfully named general, warlord actually, a sort, Mohammed Morgan, a name that is kind of interesting in itself. I won't go into great detail on that, but it's worth reading the book for that alone, the way they have to deal with it. And there you can see it does take, as you point out, very mature, seasoned men, aware of their own toughness, but not going to call on it unless it's absolutely necessary to do that.
Absolutely, and they got out of that situation by their wits. I mean, there was no way they could have asserted themselves in a military fashion and gotten out of it, but they used their wits, and they were there, and this is where the Special Forces, I think, are very valuable in terms of engaging with armed groups to understand what they're about, who they are, so they're not necessarily being sent in to kill them, which is what most people think about when they think of Somalia. They think of the Black Hawk Down scenario where they were going in to capture Mohammed Farah Aidid. And this occurred much before, where they were simply trying to understand who are these people, what were their affiliations, how were they all related, to prepare and what ultimately they were pulled out and didn't get to do their plan, but it was the beginning of a sound approach.
Well, exactly. And the one person, this I should say is a book of individuals. We meet people like Rawhide, Randall Wurst, Jimmy Newman. There's a bunch of people that we repeatedly encounter in this book in a very personal way, and we get to learn their fates. The one person you don't find in this book is Rambo, in my sense. There's no, in fact, there's a young fellow in there, a very unfortunate person who he gets the derisory nickname of Snowball because he makes the mistake of trying to emphasize his prowess and his killing ability and all of that, and that's really frowned on.
That's right, and I think probably my journey in covering these people, the reason I had doors opened was there were commanders who really wanted to overcome that Rambo stereotype. They didn't, and they knew they couldn't let a reporter in and dictate what was written, but they really said, let's try to bring them in, show them what our training is, show them what our missions are, let them have extensive access to these soldiers to tell their own missions with a lot of documentary evidence, and where I was witnessing it, I could also verify what was going on. But the resulting portrait, I think, really was not, it's the anti-Rambo, I think, really.
Yeah, anti-Rambo, indeed, and extremely instructive for that and many other reasons. And for all those reasons, Linda, as we come to the end of our conversation, just in a sentence or two, looking ahead, what do you foresee for this group? I mean, it's kind of ironic because they were found, their basic mission is you know, sort of counter to the normal construction of armies and militaries and military thinking. Unconventional, I guess, is the word that most people would use, but unconventional warfare is now the norm.
That's right. That's the key driver for, I think, the Special Forces being in such high demand, and now there is an effort underway to increase them by 1/3 is the official decision. That's very difficult to do, though, when you're looking for a certain kind of individual, giving him lots of training that's going to take time, and the key is seasoning in the field. So you can't start putting too many young people on a team. You begin to lose that sixth sense when they have, and then that's why they can afford not to pull the trigger, because they've been out there enough times that they know, okay, let's just wait a little longer. And I think that we're in a difficult time now where there's high demand, they want to grow them, but they have to be careful they keep their standards so that they don't defeat the very specialness of the unit.
Yeah, well, that's something we can all support, and I think we can support it in a much more informed way when we read books like Masters of Chaos. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you, George.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Happy to be here.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at Dialogue at wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. Thank you for talking, Linda Robinson, to great effect.
Well,